Something that I think is still very much a live question.
Yeah.
Was Brexit a mistake?
Big one.
Huge question.
Yeah, I'd say that.
And you guys have sent us a ton of stuff on this. We've got some excerpts from a really interesting discussion with two experts who kind of see this issue from very different places.
Right.
So we have Mark, who is an economist, and he's deeply concerned about the economic fallout of Brexit.
That makes sense.
And then we have James, who is a political analyst.
Okay.
And was a very strong advocate for Brexit and the sort of promise of sovereignty.
Got it.
So we're going to look at it from both sides.
Yeah, that's great, because I think, for a lot of people, myself included, this is just one of those things that's sort of rumbling along in the background.
Right.
And you see the headlines, but you don't necessarily delve into, like, what are the actual arguments?
Yeah.
What are the details here?
Exactly. And that's exactly our mission today in this deep dive, is to kind of pull out the core arguments from both sides. So you guys get a real understanding of like the crux of this debate.
Yeah.
Without having to go read, hours and hours of think tank reports and things.
Yeah, give us the shortcut.
Exactly. A shortcut to being informed.
Perfect.
Okay, so
let's
unpack this.
Okay, so I think what jumps out right away is just how different their starting points are.
Yeah.
Mark is coming at this very much from the economics.
Right.
What is the tangible impact that we're seeing, in terms of trade, in terms of growth?
Yep.
James, on the other hand, is starting from this place of principle.
Right.
National sovereignty.
Yeah.
This idea that Brexit was a necessary step towards autonomy, even if there are these short-term economic challenges that have to be dealt with.
Totally. And I think that's a good place to kind of dig in first with Mark. So Mark's perspective on the economic side of things.
All right, let's hear the doom and gloom.
Well, yeah, I mean, he doesn't really pull any punches.
Okay.
He starts right out of the gate talking about the increased trade barriers.
Okay, so what does that mean for, like, the average person?
Well, practically what this means for you is that UK businesses now face, like, a way more complex landscape when they're dealing with the EU.
Right.
So think about, like, tariffs, new regulations, a ton more paperwork.
Oh, wow.
That just didn't exist before when we were trading with, our closest neighbors.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, you're adding friction to the system.
Yeah.
So that's going to have an impact.
Right. And it's not just like abstract policy stuff.
Yeah.
He points to the very real labor shortages.
Oh, right.
That have cropped up in a bunch of key sectors.
Like what kind of sectors?
Yeah. So think about like agriculture, hospitality.
Oh, okay.
These industries that historically relied on a lot of EU workers. So when the free movement of people ends, suddenly these sectors have a massive challenge.
Yeah, where do they find people?
Right. And then on top of that, another layer is he talks about the decline in investment.
Oh, okay. So this is sort of like a ripple effect.
Exactly.
Businesses are thinking twice?
Yeah. Businesses are looking at this new landscape and they're thinking,
right, it's risky.
Do we want to invest here?
Makes sense.
There's uncertainty. There's increased costs.
Yeah.
And so that can have this ripple effect that potentially slows down the whole economy.
Right.
And he brings up this really stark figure.
Hit me.
The Office for Budget Responsibility.
Okay. OBR.
Their estimate is a 4% long-term reduction in GDP because of Brexit.
4%? That's huge.
It's significant. Yeah. And I think to put that in perspective for you.
Okay, yeah, because 4% doesn't really mean much to me.
Yeah, it's kind of an abstract number.
Yeah.
But what that could mean is like slower wage growth.
Oh, okay.
Potentially less funding for public services.
Right.
Maybe even higher unemployment over time.
Oh, wow.
So it's a big deal.
Yeah, that puts it in perspective. And so he's really painting this picture.
Yeah.
That these downsides are not just like,
inconvenience.
Yeah, little hiccups.
Yeah, it's not just red tape. Yeah. He's saying these are like fundamental, long-lasting consequences.
Right.
And it affects everything from these huge corporations that are trying to figure out new trade rules all the way down to individual consumers who might end up paying more for stuff.
Oh, right.
And he particularly calls out the struggles that farming and finance are having.
Those were both really tied into the EU.
Exactly. Both of those sectors were like super integrated with the EU.
Yeah.
Both with the regulations and the single market.
And it's not just the trade barriers themselves, it's also who they impact most. we'll talk about this more later, but, small businesses often have a way harder time dealing with all this new complexity.
Right. They don't have the resources to hire.
Yeah, exactly. They don't have teams of lawyers to figure out all this stuff.
Exactly.
So it can really stifle their growth.
Yeah, so it's like a double whammy. It's hitting certain sectors harder and it's hitting certain types of businesses harder.
Okay, so that's the economic picture.
Yeah, that's the economic picture.
Pretty bleak.
Yeah, it's not great.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit.
Okay.
Talk about James.
All right, so James's argument for Brexit boils down to this idea of regaining control.
Okay, sovereignty.
Sovereignty.
The big word.
The big S word.
Yeah, okay, so what does that mean, like, practically?
Practically for you, this means that the UK now has the power to make its own laws. Control its borders, set its own trade policies on the global stage without being bound by what the EU says.
Right. So we're calling the shots.
We are calling the shots.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it raises this really interesting question about priorities.
Yeah.
Because James is clearly saying that this regained sovereignty is such a fundamental benefit that it's worth these short-term economic adjustments.
Yeah. He's willing to accept some pain to get this long-term gain.
Right. He's playing the long game.
Yeah. And he really hammers on this point about the UK's newfound freedom to negotiate its own trade deals around the world.
Okay. So like striking out on our own?
Yeah. We can do whatever deals we want.
Right. Okay. And for him, sovereignty isn't just about what laws get passed in Parliament.
Right.
It's also about things like controlling immigration, setting our own rules and regulations.
Right.
We don't have to just automatically align with the EU.
Right.
And it's about, having an independent foreign policy.
Yeah.
We can make our own friends.
We can choose our own friends.
Exactly.
And he does point to like some tangible examples of this.
Okay, give me an example.
Yeah, so he talks about these new trade agreements that the UK has signed with countries like Australia and Japan.
Okay, yeah, I've heard about those.
Yeah, and for you, what these represent is the UK kind of actively going out there and forging new economic partnerships outside of the EU.
Right, striking our own path.
Yeah, and this is something that, people who supported Brexit, they argued that being in the EU was kind of restricting us from doing this.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But is that really true, though?
Well, this is where Mark jumps back in with a counter-argument.
Okay, I'm all ears.
He says, look, these trade deals with Australia and Japan, they're good. They're positive steps.
Yeah.
But they don't make up for the loss of access to the EU's single market.
That was like our bread and butter.
It was huge.
Yeah.
It was this massive market right on our doorstep.
Yeah. No tariffs. Yeah. Easy movement of goods.
Exactly.
It was like one giant free trade zone.
Exactly. And Mark's point is trying to replace that with a bunch of these individual deals that are scattered all over the globe is a completely different economic proposition.
Yeah, you're not comparing apples to apples.
Exactly.
Even if these deals are good, they're just way smaller.
Right. It's just the scale issue.
So it's kind of like, you've got these shiny new toys.
Right.
But you've lost your workhorse.
Exactly. And then on top of that, Mark brings up the bureaucracy issue.
Oh, right.
Which we talked about a little bit earlier.
Yeah, the paperwork nightmare.
Yeah. And he says, look, it's not just about tariffs.
Right.
It's all the extra paperwork.
See you soon for the next part.
The new customs checks at the borders.
Okay.
The fact that the regulations are now different.
Right. We're diverging.
Yeah.
So what used to be a simple process is now like a bureaucratic maze.
Exactly. And all of that adds costs for businesses.
Okay.
And he really highlights the challenges for small and medium-sized enterprises.
Right.
The SMEs.
The SMEs, yeah.
Because they often don't have like the dedicated resources.
Right. They can't hire a whole department.
Exactly. All this stuff.
They don't have the legal expertise to navigate this new complicated trade environment.
It's a real David and Goliath situation.
Yeah, it is.
You've got these big companies who can kind of muscle through.
Right.
And then these smaller businesses that are just getting crushed.
Exactly. And what I think is so interesting here is you have this contrast between this high-level view of these trade agreements being signed and then the reality on the ground for business.
We're actually trying to make things work.
Exactly.
Right.
And it really shows that there are these different layers of impact from Brexit.
It's not just about the big picture.
It's about how it affects people.
Yeah, the lived experience.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the economics.
Yeah.
Now let's kind of zoom out a little bit.
Okay.
Both Mark and James talk about the bigger political and social implications.
Okay, so the wider lens.
The wider lens.
Yeah.
And Mark kind of paints this picture of a UK that's potentially weaker.
Weaker? How?
On the global stage.
Okay.
So less influence.
Right.
Maybe weaker alliances.
Okay.
He's concerned about Scotland potentially leaving the UK.
Oh, right.
He's worried about the fragile situation in Northern Ireland.
Right. Yeah, Brexit has really stirred things up there.
Yeah, it's added a whole new layer of complexity.
Okay.
So he's really saying that Brexit has kind of destabilized things.
Like on multiple levels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
James, on the other hand, argues that implementing the referendum, respecting what the people voted for, was absolutely essential for democracy.
So he's saying you can't just ignore the will of the people.
Exactly. You have to uphold the outcome of a democratic vote.
Yeah. Even if it's messy.
Even if it's messy. Even if the consequences are difficult.
Right. Because otherwise, what does that say about our system?
Exactly. Right. And I think that raises a really interesting question about, the balance between expressing democratic will and then the practicalities.
The consequences.
The consequences of actually implementing that.
And it's interesting because James does admit that there's been more division in UK society since Brexit.
Yeah, it's hard to ignore that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's wrap up by looking at the future.
Okay.
How do these guys see things unfolding?
Crystal ball time.
Crystal ball time.
Right.
Mark is pretty skeptical.
Okay.
He says that for Brexit to work, we need some huge changes.
Like what kind of changes?
Yeah, so he's talking about things like immigration policy, trade relationships, and maybe even more importantly, we need to find a way to heal the division.
Right, bring the country back together.
Yeah, that Brexit has created.
Yeah, so he's not just talking about policy changes.
Right.
He's talking about like a shift in mindset.
Exactly.
Okay, so he's basically saying the odds are stacked against us.
He's not optimistic.
Yeah.
He looks at the economic situation. He looks at all these political challenges.
Yeah.
And he doesn't see a clear path forward.
Okay.
Unless we make some big changes.
Okay, fair enough.
James, on the other hand, has a much rosier outlook.
Okay.
He sees the UK thriving outside of the EU, forging new partnerships all over the world.
Right.
He really believes that we can make this work.
Okay, so he's leaning into the sovereignty thing.
Yeah, he thinks that independence will ultimately give us more flexibility.
Right, we can be nimble.
Yeah.
We can adapt.
Yeah.
But he's not naive about it, right? He's not saying it's going to be easy.
Exactly.
He emphasizes that we need a long-term plan.
Right.
We need to be strategic.
Yeah, this is not a sprint.
This is a marathon.
Exactly.
And I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
It's not just about making a quick buck.
Yeah.
It's about fundamentally changing how we approach trade foreign policy.
And our place in the world.
Exactly.
So to kind of bring this all together for you, we've got these two very different answers to the question of, was Brexit a huge mistake? Mark laid out all these economic challenges. We talked about the trade barriers, the labor shortages, the potential hit to GDP.
Right.
James, on the other hand, focused on this idea of national sovereignty and the potential for the UK to go out there and forge its own path in the world.
So it really comes down to what you prioritize. Mark is all about stability.
Right.
He likes the benefits of being closely tied to Europe.
Yeah.
James is more about self-determination.
Uh-huh.
He thinks we can be more agile,
Yeah.
more globally focused.
And ultimately more successful.
Exactly. And I think both of their arguments are totally valid.
Right.
They're just coming at it from different angles.
Different perspectives.
Different interpretations of like a really complex situation.
Exactly.
So it's not like one is right and one is wrong.
Yeah.
It's more about understanding the trade-offs.
Yeah.
What are you willing to sacrifice?
Yeah.
What are you hoping to gain?
And that brings us to our final thought for you guys.
All right, hit me.
So thinking about everything we've talked about today, what single factor do you think is going to determine whether Brexit is ultimately judged a success or a failure?
The million-dollar question.
The million-dollar question.
Yeah. Okay.
Is it going to be about the economics?
Okay.
Can the UK get back on track? Can we get that strong growth that we had before?
Yeah.
Or is it going to be about, our ability to use this newfound sovereignty to really